So in the first part of this week's lecture, we looked at these concepts of ontology and epistemology. And just to recap, ontology means the different paradigms or views about the nature of the world, the nature of existence, and the nature of humanity, for example. And epistemologies are the different ways we come to know these things. So what we constitute as being valid and real knowledge and truth. And so we've been looking at these and how historically they've been in a hierarchy, and there's a hierarchy of different ontologies and epistemologies, and that often Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies have been subjugated and largely ignored in that hierarchy, and we can see that in current global systems now as a result. We also looked at Western ontologies and epistemologies, and I hope it's starting to become a little bit clear how the placed hierarchy of these ontologies and epistemologies has contributed to some of the causes of climate change we are seeing now. In this video, we are going to look briefly at the parts, touching on some of these ideas that we would have already talked about before, but just reframing them through the particular lens of these perspectives. And look briefly at a video about what this means for the present time. And this will link to later in the class when we are looking at what this means, how we consider Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ontology and epistemology when imagining climate futures or the future with climate change and this climate crisis. As was pointed out in the video that you saw earlier, this term Anthropocene can often be a little bit misleading. Now, the Anthropocene, as we have spoken about before, refers to this particular time in history of the universe, I suppose, which is quite a small period of time in which human activity has had a significant impact on the globe and the environment and rapidly changed it. And this period in time that has been vastly theorized is either starting in the Industrial Revolution, or some have argued that it really only came after the Second World War, because the statistics do suggest that the impact of human activities on the environment was and is speeding up and intensifying in the last 20 years. It doesn't totally matter who is correct, because this concept is really just referring to the most, concrete period of impact. So mass amounts of impact have been seen from the Industrial Revolution, but also during periods of imperial expansion or colonization, because it was and is a method used to fund more industrialization, such as gas and coal, which is of course the leading contributor to climate change, amongst many, many other things. So the problem that the previous video was highlighting was that when we talk about the Anthropocene, we are talking about a period where human activities have impacted on the environment in significant and often negative ways, but we don't really ask or specify which human activity and which humans, because of course human activity is quite diverse, and now we know it's probably human activities of the minority, the richest of humans in the world, that is the most greatly contributing to climate change. And so we have to ask the question, which humans in this period are really contributing to the most negative impact, and which human activity is this specifically, in order to then disrupt this kind of problematic homogenization of the Anthropocene. And this really links back to part of this discussion, which needs to look at how varying ontologies and epistemologies have shaped human activities in different ways, because we know now that the way we view the world and the way we view humanity is going to impact the way in which we go about structuring our daily lives and our consumption of our diet and so on and so forth, all these methods and ideas we've looked at. And this also involves rethinking about and diversifying who we see as people, I suppose. So what we mean by the human impact specifically, and what are the sorts of paradigms that are behind issues like climate change. A number of scholars have pointed out and It's even been recognised in the latest IPCC climate change report that colonisation has had a significant impact on the world and on the environment, and has had a particularly significant driver, or an important starting point for the drivers of this Anthropocene period. And here you can see an extract from the IPCC report in which they talk about the data they have collected, which was pointing to particular conclusions. And one of those was that global patterns of inequality, including colonization, have had a significant impact on climate change. And then that neo-colonial processes continue to also have a significant negative impact. And it goes on to explain this association more. So, for example, colonialism maintains capitalism because it involves the extraction of natural resources and exploitation of people for economic profit. And once again, linking back to our epistemologies and ontologies, we can see how this can happen when you have a worldview that Earth holds instrumental value that you can use and is your right to use. So when ideas like that gain power and popularity and are normalized through colonization, through the expansion and domination of these ways of thinking, it will naturally reinforce the political power, and we see how this past has occurred. This process, of course, meant colonizers accumulated wealth and got their own economies to grow at a really rapid rate in comparison to other places, particularly the places that were colonized and then not part of the colony as well. To get into it more specifically just a little bit, this maintained wealth naturally created a favored or more powerful and forceful system that allows private ownership, which we still see today, when some people have private ownership of media or corporations and property that they use to mass produce goods or services that replace the traditional subsistent living, where people used to have more biodiverse ways of farming, which was really important for maintaining ecological systems, which in turn looked after the animals and looked after the water and looked after the soil. But these monocultural industries used to mass produce, for example, wheat or coffee or tea, were imposed in colonized nations, and we know this has led to a breakdown in biodiversity, increased water use, decreased food security, and a number of other things, including the loss of culture and traditional practices. All these things have contributed to climate change and also what we're focusing on now, climate injustice. So the extractive, exploitative, and growth-based approach, the approach of accumulation of wealth and profit to the exploitation of nature, private ownership, which has all led to a system where we have a few elite interests that are able to exploit the earth without consequence, and then the favouring of monoculture. We see so many examples of how colonization has then contributed to climate change. If we look on the right here, however, we can see or start to think about the alternative Indigenous ontologies and approaches that we are replaced with colonization. So, for example, instead of an extractive and exploitative ontology, the view, it was replaced the view that everything and everyone is does have an intrinsic value and has equal value, and an alternative ontology as well as, or an alternative way of viewing the world and nature of existence. Instead of having the goal of life being to grow and accumulate and expand, alternative epistemologies and ontologies would say that the goal of life is to maintain or to attain sufficiency, to have enough for you and your king. Instead of favouring private property, to favour the commons, to favour communal property sharing, to see that as part of the nature of your existence as a human being is to share, to not have the phenomenon we have experienced that's called the failure of the commons. and instead of favouring monoculture, to have ontology that views different parts of nature as having equal and connected value. So, for example, favouring biodiversity and diverse farming practices. These competing paradigms show some of the key causes of the climate crisis, and some potential remedies as well, or ontologies that challenge some of those causes that we see today that have contributed to climate changes thus far, but are still contributing as well. And I just wanted to finish this part of the lecture with introducing a concept that Donna Haraway talked about in an interview in 2019, because I think it exemplifies this point about the need to differentiate what we mean when we talk about the Anthropocene and all other questions that we have already outlined, like which humans and which human activity are we talking about when we're talking about this impact on the climate, particularly in different ways it's impacted the climate. And so as Donna Haraway talks about this idea of the plantation scene and the emergence of plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil even prior to the extended formal processes of colonization, and the way in which this fundamentally shaped the way human activity and its relationship to the land was shaped, and shows this shift in approaches to the land as something to dominate, and how these views were imposed onto the local people. So she talks about the plantation scene instead of the Anthropocene as being a particular period of time that involved a devastating transformation of different uses of land and different applications of land cultures, and forests into close extractive plantations founded under the work of slaves and other forms of work that were exploitative, alienating, and generally displaced people, not just from each other but also from the land, because that was the work that they had to do. So instead of living, for example, in a biodiverse setting, which they had before, people were living and working in these monoculture settings within which was accepted the diverse biodiversity. So without access to biodiversity, and in these very enclosed spaces as well. And so she talked about the plantation scene as being this period that preceded industrial capitalism and allowed to develop accumulating wealth on the back of human beings reduced to slavery. And so here this concept really gets us to question which human activities and where human activities were imposed on others as well. All right. In the next part of this lecture, we are going to talk about the present, how we now know that historically, particularly Western ontologies and epistemologies have dominated, and how our current scientific information confirms it, that these particular activities linked to colonization and linked to particular ontologies have shaped the current climate crisis that we know today.